The atmosphere in the living room was extremely depressing. "Nicole, the moment you divorce that trash and marry me, I'll immediately invest $10 million to get your company back on its feet. After that, I'll be responsible for all of Uncle's expenses in the hospital. I'll get the best doctors to treat him." A handsome young man in a dark suit and leather shoes sat on the sofa in the living room. His face was filled with an unconcealable arrogance, and he was emitting an arrogant aura. He had a cold and arrogant smile on his face as he looked at the beautiful woman standing opposite him. It seemed like he was determined to get her. "What about it, Nicole? Think about it," the man said. Nicole Midler looked calm on the surface, but inside, her heart was raging like a storm. The Midler Group was in a crisis. The capital chain had been cut off and was on the verge of bankruptcy. As the CEO of the group, she was like a helpless lamb that had been forced into a desperate situation. What made people more worried was that once the company went bankrupt, the high expenses of her father's hospital care that were currently being paid for by the group would be cut off, and the family itself would struggle to make ends meet. It seemed that only Jack Mowry, the eldest son of the Mowry Group, who was the head of LA Real Estate Corporation, could help solve the problem. Just one word from Jack Mowry, and all the Midler's problems would be solved. But to expect her to divorce her husband and then throw herself into Jack's arms, how was this possible? Nicole looked at Jack, who was sitting on the sofa with his head held high, and then looked at Mark, slumped in a corner of the living room. That was her husband. A trashy, ugly monster of a man.
"Oh my, Nicole, why are you still hesitating? Hurry up and agree to Jack's proposal. Just one word from Jack and all these problems will be solved."
Nicole's mother, Tia, walked in front of her daughter and grabbed her arm. She said anxiously,
"Nicole, Jack has always been truthful with you. If it weren't for that piece of trash Mark, you and Jack would have been a couple. Jack's willing to overlook the past and reconcile with you, so why are you still hesitating? As for Mark, he's been dragging you down for 5 years. 5 years. You should have kicked him to the curb a long time ago."
As Tia spoke, she looked angrily at Mark, who was now standing beside her. If looks could kill, Mark would have been dead 1,000 times over by now. Her daughter was far too soft-hearted. How could she let the piece of trash drag her down for so long? The words of her mother were like needles stabbing into Nicole's heart. She looked up at her useless husband and saw Mark was also looking at her. When their eyes met, Mark's eyes were filled with pleading. "Wife, don't leave me." Mark was like a lamb that was about to be thrown to the wolves. He was weak, helpless, and completely lacked the demeanor that a man should have. Whack! Tia slapped Mark square on his left cheek. Tia angrily pointed at Mark and scolded, "You are trash. Our family has kept you and got nothing for 5 years. If you're a man, leave my daughter. Don't drag our family down anymore. Get lost." Mark's face was burning with pain. His face was covered with black spots. They covered almost half of it. Plus, his body was thin and weak. His face was pale, making him look like a weak and ugly ostrich. At this moment, after being slapped by Tia, there was a red palm print on his face that was covered by the black spots. He looked even uglier. Jack stood up from the sofa. His eyes were filled with impatience. "Nicole, are you still pitying this trash? Don't you have the strength to divorce him? You're too kind. He's just a maggot and a waster. Are you going to waste your life on a person like that? What are you waiting for, Nicole? Just divorce this piece of trash." Jack had been using the tone of a negotiator before, but now his tone was filled with threats and orders. "Nicole, don't." Mark covered his face with his hands. Tears actually flowed out of his eyes. The only thing he could do now was beg.
"Good grief, be a man, will you? Tears are coming out of your eyes. This is disgusting. Why don't you go and die?"
Tia scolded him fiercely and raised her hand to hit Mark. Nicole was forced into a corner. She cried out in despair, "Mom, that's enough!" Tia looked at her daughter before shooting Mark another vicious glare and lowering her hand.
"Nicole, your father is still lying in the hospital. If our family goes bankrupt, he can only wait for death. Can it be that this piece of trash has poisoned you so much you don't even care about your father's life anymore?"
Mark stood there with a knife in his heart. Each word out of his mother-in-law's mouth twisted the blade a little deeper. He clenched his fists tightly, hating himself for being so useless. 5 years ago, he was also a member of a rich and powerful family. At that time, the Johnson family was very famous throughout LA County and was ranked first among the 3 most influential families of LA County. But, all of a sudden, the family business went bankrupt and his father committed suicide. All the members of the Johnson family disappeared, and even his mother's whereabouts were unknown. The entire Johnson family was destroyed almost overnight, draining away like snow melting in spring. It seemed like it had never existed. As for him, he'd avoided the disaster because he was out playing. At that time, when Mark was in despair over the loss of his family, a strange old man appeared to him and said,
"You should have been destroyed along with your family, but I've some history with an ancestor of yours. I owe him a favor, so I'm here to protect your life. I've given you everything I've learned in my life, all my knowledge and skills, my essence. But since you're immortal, the sudden transfer technique I used makes you weak. Your body needs time to adapt, so I've sealed this knowledge and essence within your body. You have to endure for 5 years. During these 5 years, your memories, appearance, and body will all be in a weakened state. But don't worry, I'll arrange an identity for you. If you can survive without having to worry about food and clothing, after 5 years, you will be reborn. The ugly caterpillar will become a beautiful and powerful butterfly. After that, it'll be up to you."
After that, the old man disappeared without a trace, and Mark's body and appearance had undergone a tremendous change. A large patch of black spots had grown on his originally handsome face. His muscles and the physique he'd worked so hard for had vanished, and his body had become thin and weak. He was as weak as a kitten. His brain had also become muddled, like a person suffering from dementia. Immediately after that, the Midler family had arranged for him to marry Nicole, and he'd gone along with it because it seemed like a good idea at the time. Although he didn't have to worry about food and clothing during these 5 years, he had become a complete and utter ugly monster, a wimp, and even the Midlers had been ridiculed by others for the state of their son-in-law. He had no status in the family or in the outside world. Any child could, and did, throw stones at him and spit on him. His mother-in-law, Tia, and sister-in-law, Kelly, hated him more than anyone else, to the point of wanting to kill him. His wife, Nicole, didn't have quite such a bad attitude toward him. Although they had not been real husband and wife for 5 years, they managed on the surface. And that kind father-in-law of his, when he was bullied, it was precisely because Nicole's father, Timothy, had stood up for Mark that he hadn't been chased out by his mother-in-law and sister-in-law multiple times in the past 5 years. It was a pity that a year ago, his father-in-law suddenly became paralyzed. He'd been lying in the VIP ward of LA People's Hospital, relying on expensive medicine to maintain his life. Now, Nicole's company is facing bankruptcy. A disaster seemed to have descended upon the entire Midler family in an instant. But what could he do? What worried him was that the white-bearded old man said that he would be reborn into a butterfly in 5 years. But 5 years had come and gone. Why was he still in such a cowardly and ugly state? Could it be that the old man lied to him? Or was it that he needed a special opportunity for the rebirth to take effect? Mark's expression was painful. He looked at Jack, who was sitting on the sofa in high spirits. Was he really going to watch this filthy man snatch his wife away? Mark's emotions were fluctuating. He felt something hard rolling in his stomach, making him feel sick. He raised his hand to cover his belly, but his eyes were staring at Jack again. Jack jumped to his feet, pointed at Mark, and said, "What are you looking at? You're a wimp. You think you're worthy of Nicole? If it weren't for you taking advantage of me when I went abroad 5 years ago, Nicole would have been my woman a long time ago." Mark stared at Jack blankly. His eyes didn't leave him. "Stop staring, you moron, or I'll break your legs." Jack cursed fiercely while rushing toward Mark. Nicole saw Jack's vicious eyes and was shocked. "Jack, what are you doing?" "Nicole, don't stop me. I've been annoyed by this trash for a long time. If I don't teach him a lesson today, my surname won't be Mowry." Jack instantly appeared in front of Mark. He roared furiously. "Go to hell, bastard!" After that, he raised his fist and smashed it into Mark's stomach. There was a muffled whomp, and Nicole was shocked. She wanted to stop Jack, but it was too late. Mark felt a sharp pain in his guts. The hard thing inside seemed to be broken by Jack's punch, and the pain instantly spread throughout his entire body. He hunched over, his face twisted in pain. Immediately after, he felt a scorching heat coming from his stomach, which seemed to be some kind of power. It was an indescribable feeling. An unknown power spread out and covered every nerve in his body. It started to make him feel unbearable pain, and it gradually gathered in every part of his body. The pain gradually disappeared, and he actually felt incomparably better. His weak body seemed to be filled with power in an instant. His face felt cool. He raised his fingers to touch his skin and discovered that the large patches of black spots on his face were slowly falling off. His originally lifeless eyes suddenly emitted a brilliant light. The essence energy that had been sucked away all those years ago seemed to return and was becoming stronger and stronger. He even felt that some parts of his body had bulging muscles. Power, endless power. When he straightened his body once again, his entire being had changed. Jack had punched Mark in the stomach. He looked at Mark's pained expression with satisfaction and enjoyment. But then he realized that Mark seemed to have changed after the pain. Jack's eyes widened. His fist was still in the air, ready to attack Mark for the second time. But this time, before his fist could move, Mark suddenly raised his leg and kicked Jack away with a bang. With a scream, Jack's body lifted off. He flew back a few meters and hit the wall. Then he fell heavily to the ground. The scene stunned everyone. Tia's eyes glazed over, but she came back to her senses and suddenly screamed,
What? Heavens, you trash! What did you do? You actually dared to hit Jack?
Then Tia rushed in front of Mark like a madman. She raised her fist and shouted at him while cursing.
How dare you hit Jack, you piece of trash! You want to kill us!
Mark grabbed her wrist, and his cold eyes made Tia shiver. Tia was so scared that she trembled. She had never seen Mark's eyes like this. This useless piece of trash. His eyes had always been dull and weak, but now his look could kill people. You used to beat me, scold me, insult me, and not treat me as a human being. I won't argue with you because you're Nicole's mother. But from now on, if you touch me again, I won't let you off lightly. Mark said this word by word, staring coldly at Tia.
You...
Tia was so stunned by his cold demeanor that she couldn't say a word. She looked at Mark in shock. What had changed the loser her daughter married into this imposing man? Nicole was also stunned and looked at Mark in disbelief. Jack had already gotten up from the ground. He angrily pointed at Mark and scolded. You dare to hit me! I'll kill you! After saying that, Jack clenched his fist and lunged at Mark like a furious lion. But what surprised everyone was that Mark raised his fist and smashed it into Jack's nose before Jack could strike again. The nose of this arrogant interloper was instantly dislocated, and blood flowed freely. Tia and Nicole were shocked. They didn't expect Mark to be so powerful. In fact, if they didn't see it with their own eyes, they wouldn't have believed it. Mark had always been cowardly and slow. They couldn't believe that Mark, who had always been submissive, would suddenly become so domineering and fierce. The one who was even more dumbfounded was Jack. He'd never thought that a useless loser like Mark would dare to attack him, especially so ruthlessly. Jack suddenly realized that he wasn't a match for Mark. In front of Mark, he suddenly felt like a tiny ant. The power of a man like Mark took his breath away. But he was not willing to admit defeat just like that, especially not in front of Nicole. So he fiercely wiped the blood flowing out of his nose and shouted angrily at the two bodyguards at the door. Get in here, you two! Being who he was, Jack would always take bodyguards wherever he went. but he hadn't expected any trouble from Mark, so he'd left his bodyguards outside. But now, the situation was completely beyond Jack's expectations. When the two bodyguards heard their employer's call, they ran into the living room as fast as they could. Jack pointed at Mark and said loudly, "Victor, Clint, you two kill him for me. I want him dead." Victor and Clint had strong frames and bulging muscles. It was obvious that they had gone through professional training. They turned their cold eyes to Mark at the same time. Then the two of them glanced at each other and rushed toward Mark as fast as they could.
Don't fight anymore. People will die,"
Nicole screamed.
"Jack, tell them to stop."
But it was too late. The two powerful bodyguards, Victor and Clint, had rushed in front of Mark. Nicole's heart sank. It was over. This time Mark was really finished. Nicole wondered if she should call the police. He might be pathetic, but no matter what, Mark was her husband, and Jack was an outsider. Why did he want to hit Mark anyway? She couldn't watch Mark get beaten to death. But just as she raised her phone and was about to call the police, she heard a few dull thuds. When she looked up again, she was shocked. The two fierce bodyguards who rushed toward Mark were rolling on the ground, writhing and groaning in pain, their faces scrunched up as they fought back tears. And then Nicole looked at Mark, who was standing there like a mountain, his energy spread throughout the entire house and made people shiver. Was that even still Mark? Was this man still her useless husband? When did he become so powerful?
Am I dreaming?
Nicole thought and rubbed her eyes hard. Mark was still clenching his fists. He walked to Jack, step by step. He looked down at Jack and said, "Get lost." Jack was completely dumbfounded. For the first time, he felt fear. He even felt the threat of death. He scrambled to the door and said, "Mark, you wait for me." Mark said, "Jack, I'm warning you one last time. If you dare to touch my wife again, I'll cripple you." These two words were like a bomb that exploded in Jack's head. He didn't care about his face anymore. He waved at the two bodyguards who had gotten up. "Let's go." The three figures stumbled out of the house in a sorry state.
"Mark, you..."
Tia was stunned. She looked at her useless son-in-law, Mark, in disbelief. She didn't understand why he'd changed so much in an instant. Nicole was also stunned. It was only when the phone rang that Tia suddenly came back to her senses. She hurriedly took out her phone and pressed the answer button. On the other side, Kelly's anxious voice sounded.
"Mom, you and Nicole need to come. Dad's dying." "What? What did you say?"
Tia asked. Kelly answered.
"Mom, the doctor says that Dad's organs are starting to fail, and he's given up on the instruments and the supply of medicine. Plus, we don't have the money to pay for Dad's hospital fees for the past few days, so...
Before Kelly finished speaking, Tia's hand trembled, and her phone fell to the ground. Then she cried out,
"Nicole, we have to get to the hospital now. Your dad's dying."
Nicole was also shocked and didn't care about it much as she turned around and ran out of the house. Seeing mother and daughter leaving in a rush, Mark's head drooped. He felt that there were a whole lot of memories and knowledge in his head that didn't belong to him, including ancient medical wisdom with strange names. Medicine, rebirth acupuncture, divine needle, the void body refinement technique that could cure human flesh and bones, and many other mysterious techniques like cultivation techniques, cultivation levels, spirit pill forging, and the like. What were these things? It was as if there was nothing that could stop them from entering his mind. Could it be that this was what the old man meant about being reborn and becoming a butterfly in 5 years? In that case, he really had to thank Jack for that punch. It seemed to have been a trigger that could turn the world upside down. Have I really been reborn? Transformed into a butterfly from a caterpillar? Mark wondered, raising his arm. Strength. His entire body was filled with strength. It seems like the old man didn't lie to me. From today, I, Mark, am no longer a wimp. From today, I'll make everyone look at me in a new light.
I'll let those who've bullied and ridiculed me know what regret is."
Mark shook his head hard. Suddenly, he remembered that his father-in-law was about to die. Without saying another word, he chased after his wife and her mother. By the time Mark caught up to her, Nicole had already started the car. Mark quickly opened the back door and jumped in. Tia was also sitting in the back. When she saw Mark get in, she immediately glared at him and said,
"What are you doing here? Get out of the car!"
Mark turned his head to look at her. He really couldn't understand why this woman always had an aggressive look every time she saw him. "Can't I go and see my father-in-law?" Mark didn't show any weakness. He stared into Tia's eyes and spoke clearly.
"Father-in-law? You think you're worthy of being his son-in-law? Bah, get the hell out of here. Otherwise, don't blame me for being rude."
Tia raised her hand and was about to hit Mark. Mark's powerful energy was unleashed, and he stared coldly at Tia. Tia couldn't help but be stunned, and her raised hand froze in midair.
"All right, Mom. We don't have time. Stop making a fuss,"
Nicole said impatiently, and then she pulled out into traffic and sped to the hospital. Tia snorted and put her hand down. She didn't speak anymore. Half an hour later, the car stopped at LA People's Hospital. The three of them got out of the car as quick as they could and headed straight to the VIP ward on the third floor of the inpatient department. Just as they walked to the door of the VIP ward on the third floor, they heard a young woman's voice from inside.
"What are you doing? Don't touch my dad. Get lost. Get lost."
Nicole frowned. She could tell that this was the voice of her younger sister, Kelly. Without any hesitation, she quickly stepped into the ward. Following closely, Tia and Mark also entered the ward. There was an old man lying on the bed in the ward. His body was covered with tubes, and a young woman was hovering close by. She shouted at the two doctors in white coats and a nurse.
"Kelly, how's Dad?"
Nicole shouted. Kelly saw her mother and sister coming in and immediately felt relief. She grabbed Nicole's arm and cried,
"Nicole, it's about time you got here. These doctors are really useless. They want to stop treatment. They're trying to turn off Dad's respirator. They even stopped his machine. They're going to let Dad die."
When she heard this, Tia's violent temper rose. She stamped her foot, pointed at the two doctors in white coats, and scolded loudly.
"How can you be like this? Other doctors try to save lives and fix injuries. But you want to just let my husband die? Why aren't you giving him medicine? Do you want him to die?"
The young male doctor, Dr. Blake, said, "Mrs. Midler, you've got it wrong. You all know Mr. Midler's condition. He's been in a coma for a year, and we've done our best. But now his organs are starting to fail, and there's no point in trying to treat him any longer. Besides, you already owe more than a month of medical fees, and you haven't paid them yet."
Dr. Blake.
Dr. Stevens, a man in his 60s whose hair was already white, interrupted his colleague's words. He then eased his tone and said to Tia,
I can understand your feelings. For the past year, your husband relied on expensive medicine and instruments to maintain his life. But a year ago, he was diagnosed as brain dead. The organs in his body were still functioning, which is the state we are talking about. But now his condition has changed, and the organs in his body are failing. Medication can't help in this situation, and the respirator will only increase his pains. So,
Is that why you removed the respirator and stopped supplying medication? Won't that make him die faster?
Tia shouted loudly, and her face revealed a look of extreme grief. She turned her head to look at the old man lying in the hospital bed, who was also her husband. She couldn't help but cry.
Timothy, you can't die. If you die, I don't want to live anymore.
Dr. Stevens sighed and shook his head.
I'm sorry. We've tried our best. Please, accept our condolences.
These words undoubtedly sentenced Timothy Midler to death. Nicole, Kelly, and Tia wept. For a moment, the atmosphere in the ward was desolate. Only Mark stood there without moving. From the moment he came in, he had been staring at his father-in-law, Timothy, in the bed. Some medical knowledge that he couldn't understand kept appearing in his mind. It was this medical knowledge that gave him great confidence in an instant. He suddenly took a step forward and said, "Let me take a look." As he said that, he walked over and sat beside the bed. He reached out and grabbed one of his father-in-law's hands.
What are you doing? Take your dirty hands off him. Don't touch my dad.
Kelly suddenly shouted and slapped Mark's hand away. But Mark didn't care. He immediately grabbed his father-in-law's hand again and started to take his pulse. Kelly was furious. She jumped up and pushed Mark hard on the shoulder.
You useless piece of trash! Get out of my way!
But she didn't expect Mark to sit there steadily like a mountain after she used so much strength. In the end, not only did she not push Mark, she even rebounded a couple of steps. Kelly was flustered and exasperated. She clenched her fist and smashed it down hard on Mark's back.
It's all because of you, you ugly bastard! You jinxed my dad to death! Why did you ever marry into our family? You're the one who brought bad luck to us.
Mark, on the other hand, sat there without moving. He allowed his sister-in-law's fists to hit his back like raindrops, but he focused on checking his father-in-law's pulse. He didn't know medicine at all, but when he touched his father-in-law's pulse, a line of information appeared clearly in his mind. An unknown accumulation of poison has gathered in the brain, leading to brain death. But the organs are still functioning, so he has become like this. Right now, the toxins gathered in the brain are slowly spreading to the whole body. That's what's causing the organs in his body to start failing as well. Mark instantly frowned. Poison? Is there poison in my father-in-law's body? Did he become like this because he was poisoned? How could this be? Moreover, this poison was very strange, silently invading the human body. Even modern advanced medical instruments couldn't detect it, and could only show the sufferer to be in a coma. It didn't seem like a big problem. As long as he forced out the poison in Timothy's brain and organs, the man would recover. Mark immediately made a judgment in his heart. His father-in-law had been doing good deeds throughout his life and had been very good to him. He was the only one who didn't despise him for being a useless person or an ugly monster. Instead, he protected Mark at all times. Mark owed Timothy big time, so his father-in-law had to be saved. But at this moment, Tia saw Mark pretending to take Timothy's pulse. Anger rose in her heart. She also jumped to her feet. Pointing at Mark, she said loudly,
What are you doing? Why are you pretending to take Dad's pulse? Get lost!
Kelly backed her mother up.
Get lost, you chinks!
Their vile attitudes toward Mark caused the two doctors to step in. Dr. Stevens said,
All right, we've said what needs to be said. We're sorry, but there's no point making a scene. It's better for you to make final arrangements for Mr. Midler as soon as possible.
Mark suddenly stood up and said, What final arrangements? My father-in-law isn't going to die. Then he turned to look at the two doctors. My father-in-law was clearly poisoned with a strange kind of poison that invaded his brain and caused a brain death. It's spreading throughout his body, but if we can force it out, nothing will be a problem. The two doctors were stunned. They looked at Mark as if they were looking at an alien.
What did you say? Poisoned? Are you kidding? If it were poison, we'd be able to detect it, wouldn't we?
Mark didn't want to waste any more time talking nonsense. He waved his hand and interrupted the two doctors' questions. Then he said, You guys can't cure Timothy's illness, but I can. He won't die. I'll save him. The two doctors were even more surprised. The young male doctor said, Are you joking? The patient's been declared dead, yet you claim you can save him. Do you think you're a god? Nicole, Kelly, and Tia also looked surprised when they heard that, but what followed was anger. What did this good-for-nothing say? He actually said that he could save people. What is he bragging about? Disgusting. Nicole said, "Mark, don't cause trouble here. Please, just leave. I'm begging you." "Nicole, I really can't save your dad," Mark said. "You damn idiot." Tia couldn't help but curse. Then she took a deep breath and got hold of herself. She said, "Okay, this is the hospital. I don't want to scold you anymore. Get out of here. Disappear. Don't let me see you again." Kelly also shouted hysterically, "Pathetic loser! Hurry up and get lost! Don't give us any more trouble!" The two doctors also shook their heads and prepared to leave. They didn't take Mark's words to heart at all. "Wait," Mark shouted at the two doctors. "I need needles for acupuncture. Can you help me get some?" The two doctors stopped and looked at Mark in disbelief. Mark tried again. "Sorry to trouble you. Please, help me get a needle bag. I know I can save my father-in-law." Dr. Stevens said, "Young man, I can understand your feelings, but life and death are determined by fate. Sometimes we can help people, but sometimes we can't do anything in the face of disease. You have to accept reality. My condolences." Dr. Stevens thought that Mark had claimed he could save Timothy just because he was so upset. "No, please, leave me. I can really save my father-in-law." As he spoke, Mark walked up to Dr. Stevens. He said earnestly, "Doctor, please trust me this once, okay? Help me get a needle bag." Dr. Stevens was instantly stunned. Mark's gaze shocked him. He looked at this young man who didn't look like much, and even had black spots on his face that had yet to fade. For some reason, he suddenly felt that this young man was something special. He had the impression that this young man wasn't lying. He didn't seem to be joking either. Beside him, Dr. Blake was a little impatient. "Dr. Stevens, there are still patients over there. Let's go. Don't waste time with him." Dr. Blake turned around and walked toward the door. At that moment, Dr. Stevens suddenly said, "Dr. Blake, go and get the needle bag I gave the patient for acupuncture." Dr. Blake was stunned for a moment. "No, Dr. Stevens, do you really believe that this person can save the patient? Mr. Midler has already been sentenced to death. Even if a god descended, Mr. Midler couldn't be saved." "Stop talking. Go and get my needle bag," Dr. Stevens said. He was thinking that if this young man was talking big, if he was messing around, it would just be a waste of time. He wanted to see this young man who exuded a unique energy. Would he be able to create a miracle? Dr. Blake was speechless, but he still followed Dr. Stevens' instructions and quickly fetched the needle bag he used for acupuncture. Mark took the needle bag and thanked Dr. Stevens, then turned around and walked to the front of the hospital bed. He put the needle bag away, then swiftly removed his father-in-law's shirt and took out the silver needles from the needle bag. "Trash! Are you serious? Stop right now!" Tia was about to roar again when Mark suddenly turned his head and stared at her with a cold gaze. He said, word by word, "I'm saving someone. If anyone disturbs me, I'll throw them out, no matter who it is." These few short words and imposing manner actually stunned Tia and Kelly. The two of them immediately shut up. Mark pulled out the silver needles and inserted them into several important acupuncture points on his father-in-law's body. All 9 important acupuncture points in the human body were filled with silver needles. Then, Mark rolled the silver needles one by one. No one noticed. When he was rolling the silver needles, faint spiritual energy drifted out from between his fingers and was injected into his father-in-law's 9 important acupuncture points alongside the silver needles. Everyone on the scene held their breaths and looked at Mark, but in fact, no one held any hope for him, including Dr. Stevens. Although they felt that this young man was emitting an extraordinary aura, Dr. Stevens only wanted him to mess around for a while. He wanted to make the Midlers give up after being powerless to reverse the situation. But no one had expected that a miracle would really happen a few minutes later. Timothy, who was lying in the hospital bed unresponsive, suddenly moved his finger. Then an expression began to appear on his face, although it was an extremely painful expression. Then, Timothy suddenly sat up in the bed and spat out a mouthful of black blood. Everyone was shocked and couldn't believe what they saw. After that, Timothy spat out 3 mouthfuls of black blood in a row. Then he began to pant heavily and lay back in the bed.
"Oh my God, Dad's awake!"
Kelly shouted first. Timothy had indeed woken up. Although his face was pale and he was breathing heavily, he was much better than before. He opened his eyes and looked around. He asked weakly, Where am I?" "Dad, don't move. I'll help you remove the needle." Mark quickly pulled out the silver needle from his father-in-law's acupuncture point and put it back into the needle bag. Mark's previous judgment was not wrong. His father-in-law was not actually ill. Instead, he was poisoned by a strange poison that was difficult to detect. The poison had spread into his body and his brain, but it had been forced out by the acupuncture technique, which was why his father-in-law was fine.
"My dad really came back to life! Oh my God, this is really the blessing of God!"
Kelly and her mother cried tears of joy. Dr. Stevens and Dr. Blake looked at each other and almost simultaneously spat out, "Impossible." Timothy Midler had been dead to all intents and purposes. How could he possibly come back to life? Dr. Stevens looked at Mark. Was it really because this young man casually pricked him with a few needles? Suddenly, his mind went blank. No, that's not right. Why were the few needles that this young man inserted just now so familiar? Dr. Stevens suddenly remembered. Wasn't that the rebirth acupuncture technique that could bring human flesh and bones back to life? But after thinking about it, that was impossible. Only the ancient medical sages knew this kind of unique needle technique. The knowledge of how to do it had been lost long ago. How could this young man called Mark know such a needle technique? Using a rebirth acupuncture technique to save a person who was on the verge of death was impossible, wasn't it?
"Has my father really come back to life? My dad is really fine now?"
Nicole almost couldn't believe that this was true. Mark said, "Nicole, your dad has been saved. If you don't believe me, you can take him for a physical examination. He should be fine, but he's still a little weak. He will be fine after a few days of rest at home." Nicole looked at Mark with a dumbfounded expression. Did her useless husband really save her father? But how was this possible? He was a useless man. He didn't know medicine at all. With just a few simple needles, was he able to save her dying father? Kelly snorted and said,
"What did he save? I think this trash was just lucky, like a blind man falling over a wallet full of cash. In fact, it was because my father did good deeds that he was moved to heaven, and that was why he came back to life." That's right. Mark, this good-for-nothing, casually pricked him with a few needles. How could he have saved your dad? It must be because your father has done too many good deeds, and the Heavenly Father wouldn't accept him. That's why he came back to life. All right. Let's hurry up and take your father for a physical examination. That way we can be more at ease,"
Tia said. The mother and daughter helped Timothy off the bed and went for a physical examination. Mark was stunned for a moment and wanted to follow them. Dr. Stevens suddenly came back to his senses and said to him, "Young man, who are you?" Mark said, "I'm just an ordinary person." "Impossible. If you were an ordinary person, how could you have known the rebirth acupuncture technique?" Mark smiled bitterly and muttered in his heart, "Even I freaking don't know how I know rebirth acupuncture. It can't be from that old man years ago, can it? He said that he wanted to pass on his life's knowledge to me and that he sealed it in my body for 5 years. Now that 5 years have passed, I mysteriously learned medicine." Mark shook his head. He felt that everything was so unreal, and then he quickly walked out of the ward. Dr. Stevens was still shocked by Timothy Midler's miraculous recovery. After a while, he said to Dr. Blake, who was also dumbfounded, "A person who knows rebirth acupuncture and can use acupuncture techniques to such perfection, he's definitely not an ordinary person. Who is this young man called Mark?" Dr. Blake said, "Dr. Stevens, isn't he just a son-in-law in the Midler family? What's there to investigate?" "We can't just look at the surface," Dr. Stevens said. "This is a kind of person who lives under the radar.
I think this young man is deliberately hiding himself. Otherwise, why didn't he save Timothy Midler earlier? Why did he have to wait a year to save him?
Dr. Blake suddenly thought of something. By the way, they owe a month's medical expenses. They haven't paid yet. Could we come to some kind of agreement with him for services? Dr. Stevens said impatiently,
What do you want to pay? A person who can use rebirth acupuncture to save a person is not an ordinary expert. What are you waiting for? Quickly go and find out.
Okay, Dr. Blake replied and walked out. In the ward, Dr. Stevens was still stunned. He muttered to himself,
This young man knows rebirth acupuncture. Maybe he could save the grandfather from the Green family, because his situation is almost the same as Timothy's. It was all without any warning. Suddenly his brain died and went into a coma.
Thinking of this, Dr. Stevens quickly took out his phone and dialed a number. The call was quickly picked up. A young woman's voice came from the other end.
Hello, Uncle Harry. This is Marcy.
Dr. Stevens suppressed the excitement in his heart and said,
Marcy, your grandfather's illness can be cured.
Marcy was stunned for a moment.
Uncle Harry, what did you say? Is Grandpa saved? How is this possible? Grandpa has been in a coma for 3 years. In that time, almost all the famous doctors in the world came to see him. None of them could wake Grandpa up a year ago. My father and I have spent a lot of money to recruit the best medical experts. They formed a research team to study and cure my grandpa's illness. Although they developed some new drugs with the research, they didn't manage to wake my grandpa up.
Marcy, I told you earlier that relying on those foreigners and experts is useless,
said Dr. Stevens.
But I've met a godly doctor. He's actually able to use the lost rebirth acupuncture technique to perfection. This person can save your grandfather.
What? Really? Rebirth acupuncture? The legendary rebirth acupuncture that is supposed to be able to reincarnate human flesh and bones? I thought it was a lost technique.
It is lost, but that young man somehow knows it. I saw it with my own eyes. He even saved a patient who had the same symptoms as your grandfather. So, Marcy, this young man is the only hope to save your grandfather.
Who is he? Where is he now?
I only know that his name is Mark. He's the son-in-law of the Midler family. As for the rest of the information, you know as much as I do. You could look into it, couldn't you?
Don't worry. I'll send someone to investigate right now,
Marcy said. With her family's power, it was easy to investigate a person's background and find out everything about them.
Marcy, remember, this person is not simple. He might be the only person alive who can save your grandfather, so you must sincerely and personally invite him. Understand?
I understand, Uncle Harry, and thank you.
Marcy hung up the phone, unable to suppress the excitement in her heart. Although she felt that what her Uncle Harry said was not possible, she knew that he wouldn't lie to her. Since Uncle Harry said that person could save her grandfather, then he could definitely save him. Tia and Kelly took Timothy back home after his physical examination. Just like Mark said, apart from Timothy's weak body, everything else was normal. This was unbelievable. More than that, it was great news to the members of the Midler family that Timothy had come back to life. But no one gave Mark the credit. Both Tia and Kelly firmly believed that it was because Timothy had done good deeds for so many years that he was moved by the heavens and he was able to come back to life. As for Mark, it was just a blind man tripping over a wallet full of cash. A happy accident. Even Nicole thought that it was just a coincidence because her useless husband, Mark, couldn't possibly have medical skills. So, although the people of the Midler family were very happy, Their attitude toward Mark didn't change. Tia continued to shout at him, and when she returned home, she kept scolding him.
Trash, what are you still standing there for? Hurry up and help your dad to bed so that he can have a good rest. Hey, go and get your dad a cup of water. Why are you so blind? Bastard, who asked you to sit on the sofa? Can't you see that it's almost dark? Hurry up and prepare dinner.
Ignoring the scolding, Mark remained expressionless. He did everything he was told because, 1, he was used to it, and 2, his father-in-law had come back to life. It was only natural for him to do helpful things for his father-in-law. But his father-in-law, Timothy, couldn't stand it any longer. He said to Tia and Kelly, "I'm fine now. Let Mark rest for a while. Can't the two of you be nicer to him? We are family, after all." Mark was busy in the kitchen alone. Nicole walked into the kitchen.
"Let me help you."
"No need. I can handle it alone. Nicole, you go and keep Dad company," Mark said. An hour later, Mark finished preparing dinner. The table was laden with dishes. The family sat around and started to eat. Because Timothy had recovered, the family was in a good mood. The atmosphere at the dinner table was happy. Although Tia and Kelly would scold Mark from time to time, Mark didn't care. But this harmonious atmosphere didn't last long. When they were halfway through the meal, Nicole's phone rang. She pressed the answer button, and an anxious voice immediately came from the other end.
Miss Midler, because of a lack of funds, the company is about to stop operating. What should we do?
It was Nicole's secretary and assistant, Anna, calling.
Miss Midler, we must raise funds as soon as possible. Otherwise, the company really will go bankrupt. Right at this moment, the Anderson family is sending people over to make an offer on the company. The Midler Group is worth several tens of millions no matter what, but the Andersons actually expect to buy you into selling at a price of $5 million. Other companies are covetously eyeing the company too. They think that we definitely won't be able to weather this storm, so they want to kick us while we're down. They want to force us to sell the company to them at a low price. It's detestable.
Anna was furious, and the bottom dropped out of Nicole's good mood. Nicole was furious. If they lost the company, the whole Midler family would go crazy.
Anna, don't worry, Nicole said.
I'll think of something. Although she was as upset about the situation as everyone else, Nicole, as the leader, still knew it was her job to comfort her subordinates. Anna, her assistant, said,
Miss Midler, we don't have much time left. The company's middle management staff are usually loyal to the company, but now some of them see that the company is going to go bankrupt. Someone even submitted a resignation letter and wanted to change jobs, but I convinced them to stay on for now. But the company is in a state of panic. If we wait any longer, I'm afraid they'll all quit. Also, Miss Midler, just now the eldest son of the Mowry real estate company, Jack, called and spoke that as long as Miss Midler agrees to be with him, he will immediately...
Don't say more, Nicole interrupted Anna. Don't mention Jack to me again.
But Miss Midler, only Jack can save our company now.
All right, I'll think of something. Give me a little more time. You hold on at the company. Please, Anna. After Nicole said that, she hung up the phone feeling frustrated. The family at the table was stunned. All eyes turned to Nicole.
Nicole, have the matters in the company not been resolved yet?
Kelly asked.
It sounds like the company's really in hot water.
Tia sighed.
What are we going to do? If the company goes bankrupt, how will our family live?
She added.
We'll lose everything.
Tia took a breath and started again.
Nicole, I think you should promise to marry Jack. I think he really loves you. You two are a match made in heaven. You should have been together from the beginning. Listen to me. Divorce this piece of trash immediately and go find Jack. He will definitely be able to help you."
Before Tia could finish speaking, Timothy angrily slammed his palm down on the table and said, "Is there another mother like you? Do you really want your daughter to make a deal with Jack? Jack is not a good thing. I've said it before and I'll say it again. No matter how difficult it is for our family, we can't go and beg Jack."
"Timothy, what are you talking about? I'm doing this for the sake of our daughter. What's wrong with Jack? He's handsome and capable. If you hadn't stopped him, Nicole would have married him long ago."
Jack had been pursuing Nicole for a very long time, but Timothy had never liked it. He was sure that Jack was not a good person. If Nicole married him, it would be like walking over hot coals. Later on, Mark appeared, and Timothy received a secret letter. So, without another word to anyone, he immediately married his daughter to Mark. Because of this, Jack left the country in a fit of anger, but Timothy didn't expect that after 5 years, Jack still wouldn't give up and would come back to pester his daughter.
"Timothy, I am not talking about you. I have no idea what you were thinking back then. You didn't want your daughter to marry Jack, but you recruited this totally useless person to be your son-in-law. You ruined your daughter's life,"
Tia complained. "If my daughter marries Jack, then her life will be ruined," Timothy said.
"You?"
Tia began, but Nicole cut her off. Nicole stood up anxiously and loudly said, "Enough. Stop arguing. Can't you let me have some peace?" After saying that, she left the dining table and wandered over to sit on the sofa. Mark quietly stood up and walked over to sit beside her. "Nicole, don't worry. I'll think of a way to help you," Mark said. His words immediately attracted Tia and Kelly's ridicule.
"You? What can a piece of trash like you think of? Could it be that you can get $10 million to save my sister's company?" $10 million? He couldn't get $10 million even if he sold himself for medical experiments. Look at him. There's more value in Jack's little finger than in this piece of trash. Nicole marrying him brought on enough bad luck for 8 lifetimes.
Mark didn't seem to hear their mockery. He saw his wife, Nicole's flustered look, and felt very sad and distressed. "Nicole, it's just $10 million. I can think of a way to earn that much. I know I can. Things will get better," Mark said, and gently grabbed Nicole's hand. Nicole suddenly pulled her hand back and said agitatedly, "Don't bother me. Can I have some quiet time, please?" Kelly stood up from the dining table, pointed at Mark, and scolded.
"Stop being disgusting here. $10 million. How can you get it just like that? Who do you think you are? Other than making trouble for our family, trash, what else can you do? I really don't understand the meaning of a person like you even being alive. If I were you, I would have taken a long dive off a tall building a long time ago."
"Enough! Stop talking!" Timothy slammed his fist on the table again and said, "Mark has good intentions. Isn't he comforting your sister?"
Kelly sneered. "Comfort? What use is there in comfort? Nicole needs money if she's going to save the company."
Just as the family was wondering what to do next, the doorbell suddenly rang. Tia angrily looked at the door and then scolded Mark.
"What are you standing there for? Go and answer the door."
Mark stood up and walked to the door and opened it. There was a woman in her 20s standing outside the door. She was dressed in casual clothes and had a long ponytail. She looked very fresh and pretty. Behind her were 2 men in black. Mark was stunned. "Who are you looking for?" The woman smiled.
"Is this Mr. Johnson's residence?"
Mark was stunned again. Mr. Johnson? Why did these words sound so awkward? Because no one had ever called him Mr. Johnson. Mark frowned. You Are looking for me? But I don't know you. Mark felt depressed. He'd never seen this woman before. Although this woman dressed casually, her demeanor was not something ordinary people generally had. My name is Marcy. Although you don't know me, I know you. Can I come in and talk to you? The woman looked inside. When she heard Mark talking to someone outside the door, Tia impatiently shouted, "Who is it?" Mark stepped back and let the woman into the room. As for the two men in black, they stayed outside the door. Sorry to bother you. I'm here to talk with Mr. Johnson, the woman said. The people of the Midler family were stunned. Kelly said, What did you say? Mr. Johnson? Holy cow, you actually called him Mr.? Why does it sound so funny? Tia said, Who are you? We don't know you. Why are you looking for that piece of trash? Marcy frowned at the way they were talking about Mark with him standing right there. What weird relationship did this family have with the man? As the head of the family and a kind old man, Timothy politely stood up and said to Marcy,
A guest is a guest, Tia. Miss, please have a seat and say what you need to.
Marcy smiled politely. Thank you, no need. I'm here to issue an invitation to Mr. Johnson. After saying that, she turned her eyes to Mark, who was standing to one side. You are Mr. Johnson, right? Can you come with me, please? Mark said,
I don't really know you. Are you sure you have the right person?
Marcy nodded. I do. I've seen your photo. It can't be wrong. Mr. Johnson, I sincerely invite you to come with me. Is that okay? Mark shook his head no.
Not until I know where you want me to go.
To my house, Marcy replied. Kelly asked, You want this piece of trash to go to your house? Mark was stunned. The others were also stunned. No one had a clue what this woman was trying to do. Tia, however, jumped to her feet. She shouted out as if she had just discovered Mark's dirty little secret. Trash, what is your relationship with this woman? She's brazenly asked you to go to her house with her. Why would she want you to do that? The two of you? Don't tell me the two of you have that kind of relationship. Mark, you haven't been cheating on my daughter, have you? Hearing these words, a trace of anger flashed across Marcy's face. Anywhere else, if someone dared to be so disrespectful to her, Miss Green, she would have already gotten someone to throw this middle-aged woman out. But as much as she'd love to do it, she couldn't do it now. She needed Mark to do something for her. Besides, this wasn't her house, so she didn't have the authority. Marcy was a steady and calm person who did things without showing her emotions. So, even though her unhappiness flashed across her face, she continued to maintain a smile and said, Please, don't misunderstand me. I'd like Mr. Johnson to come to my house to treat my grandfather. Hearing her words, the people of the Midler family were even more dumbfounded. What? Treating illnesses? What do you mean? They chorused. My grandfather has an illness that is exactly the same as Mr. Midler's illness, Marcy said and looked at Timothy. Before she arrived, she had investigated this family thoroughly. Marcy continued. I didn't believe it at first, but now I see that Mr. Midler has been completely cured by Mr. Johnson. I can see that Mr. Johnson is like a living god with incredible skills. So, I would like to ask Mr. Johnson to come with me. Although she was asking for help, her tone was neither servile nor overbearing. Her attitude and manner were that of a young woman from a big family, a young woman used to lead. It had a chilling effect on the Midler family. Although she didn't know Marcy's identity, seeing the commanding attitude of this woman, Tia didn't dare to speak nonsense anymore. Instead, she took a chance and laughed out loud. Did I actually hear you right? You actually said that this piece of trash has incredible skills? This is too ridiculous. Do you really want to invite him to treat your grandfather's illness? You must hate your grandfather. This piece of trash is not a doctor, and he doesn't understand medicine at all. He's nothing but a wimp. Kelly seemed to have heard the funniest joke in the world. She joined in her mother's laughter.
Miss, Mark didn't cure my father. No. My dad just came back to life. He was sticking needles into my dad at the time, so it seemed like he cured my dad. Actually, it wasn't like that at all. It was a complete coincidence. Sorry, but you're barking up the wrong tree. Yes, miss, I'm sorry for your grandfather, but you have definitely found the wrong person, Tia added.
Is that so? Marcy couldn't help but mutter in her heart, especially when she examined Mark's still unattractive appearance. He didn't look like a godly doctor at all. Besides, he was so young. But Uncle Harry said that he was a godly doctor. It couldn't be a lie, could it? Timothy Midler was certainly sitting at the dining table, large as life. Had he really been cured by Mark, or was this just a coincidence? Whatever, since she was here already, if there was even a glimmer of hope, Marcy would do what she could. Marcy made up her mind, and then said to Mark, Mr. Johnson, do you have any medical skills at all? Anything? Since I've come personally to invite you, please come with me and at least try. Surprisingly, Mark took a step forward and looked at this woman with a tremendous poise. He said very seriously, I can save your grandfather. Marcy was stunned, along with everyone else in the room. Kelly said, What are you talking about, trash? You don't have any medical skills or knowledge at all. Why do you insist on pretending to be a big shot? Mark ignored Kelly and continued to say to Marcy, Since I could cure my father-in-law, I can cure your grandfather, no matter what kind of illness your grandfather is suffering from. Marcy raised her chin and looked at the young man in front of her with great interest. At the same time, she judged that this young man was really confident. Or was he just talking big? You're that confident? Marcy asked. Mark nodded. Absolutely. Since you came to find me today, you must have confidence in me too. Am I right? But it doesn't matter. Even if you don't have confidence in me, it doesn't matter. When I cure your grandfather's illness, I believe you'll have a whole new level of respect for me. Mark's words completely shocked the Midlers. Damn, this piece of trash is addicted to boasting, and he's shameless. He thinks that others will look at him in a new light? What does he think he is? Does he really think of himself as a godly doctor? Kelly said with an exaggerated expression of amazement. Whatever you think, I've invited Mr. Johnson to come with me, Marcy said. She sincerely came to invite Mark today. She had thought he would probably put on airs and say a few polite words, but she didn't expect him to agree so readily. She'd expected to have to work to convince him. Wait, Mark said. Marcy looked at him with her bright eyes. I'm willing to cure your grandfather, but what can you give me in exchange? Mark said. He was talking about conditions, trying to make a deal. What do you want? Marcy asked with interest. Money. Can you give me money? Mark said. Marcy was stunned for a moment, and then smiled. Of course I can. How much do you want? $10 million. Mark didn't even think about it and spat out the number. Tia, Kelly, Nicole, and Timothy all opened their mouths wide in shock. 10 million? Was this guy crazy? He knew nothing, yet he pretended to be a big shot and asked for $10 million? This person was really sick. Nicole couldn't continue watching. She felt that her husband was a joke right then. She stood up. Mark, that's enough. Stop showing off. Then Nicole said to Marcy, I'm sorry, miss. You found the wrong person. My husband does not know medicine at all, so he's no good to you. He cannot treat your grandfather's illness. Please, find someone else. Mark was a little anxious. Nicole, don't. This is a chance for me to earn money at last. Don't blow this for me, please. Nicole glared at him fiercely and softly scolded. Are you sick? What chance to earn money? You don't know anything at all. How are you going to earn money? Mark wanted to explain, but Marcy suddenly smiled and said, 10 million, that's easy. As long as you can cure my grandpa, 100 million is not a problem. The people of the Midler family were shocked. This woman had actually agreed to Mark's crazy demand. Mark was somewhat amazed. He said, Really? Can you really give me 10 million? Is your family very rich? Mark had to confirm whether this woman had $10 million in her family. If she gave him a dud check, he might never find a way to earn enough to help his wife's company. Nicole almost fainted when she heard Mark ask if there was money in Marcy's family. She couldn't believe he would be so rude. But Marcy was amused by Mark's straightforward manner. She thought it was cute that he actually directly asked if her family was very rich.
Don't worry, money is nothing to the Green family. I will definitely keep my word, if you cure my grandfather, Marcy said.
Green family? Tia's expression changed. Which Green family? Tia wondered. Could it be the family of the richest man in California? The biggest big shot in the business world? That Green family? The family who managed most of the industries in California, including real estate, hotels, entertainment, and logistics. Marcy. Wait, why was her name so familiar all of a sudden? Oh my God, was she the granddaughter that the patriarch of the Green family, Mr. James Red Green, valued the most? That Marcy? Tia was so shocked after she figured it out that she couldn't speak. Timothy also instantly realized Marcy's identity. In all of California, no matter how ignorant a person was, it was impossible for them not to know the reputation of the Green family.
You're the granddaughter of the richest man in California, the princess of the Green family, Marcy?
Tia couldn't help but ask. Heavens, she'd never have believed it in a million years. The princess of a super-rich family, which was so far away from Tia's life, was now standing in front of her. Nicole and Kelly's expressions also instantly changed. What? Marcy? The granddaughter of the richest man in California, the granddaughter of Red Green, who was ranked third on the national list of the richest men. Good grief. This pretty and easygoing woman standing in front of them was actually as rich as Midas. In an instant, everyone was stunned. Marcy, on the other hand, had a carefree look on her face. Her focus had remained on Mark.
I'll say it again. Money is nothing to the Green family. 10 million is nothing. I can even give you $1 billion. But the prerequisite is you must cure my grandfather. You need to put your money where your mouth is if you want to get paid.
Marcy still had a smile on her face, but her tone was firm. Mark was overjoyed. His heart felt like it might burst. Since this woman had the money, it was an easy decision to make. Immediately, he slapped his palms together and said decidedly, "All right, let's go then." After saying that, he turned around and walked toward the door.
Stop right there!
Tia suddenly shouted and walked over in a flustered and exasperated manner. She pushed Mark to the side.
You idiot! Don't you know who this woman is? She is the princess of the Northern California Green family. The Northern California Green family is a family so wealthy that you would never be able to imagine it. How could you think of putting on a show in the house of a family like that? Do you actually want to die?
Kelly immediately walked over in exasperation.
Trash, you're acting all big, but this is not a joke. If you don't know anything and then pretend to be the hottest thing since sliced bread at curing people, you're definitely courting death. It's fine with me if you do want to die, just don't implicate us. If you can't cure old Red Green, the people of the Green family will have you killed. And then the people of the Green family will kill all of us.
Nicole was also in a panic. She walked over and pulled Mark to the side.
I beg you, don't make trouble for me again, okay? You don't know medicine at all. Quickly tell Miss Green the truth so she'll leave us alone.
Nicole, I can cure her grandfather. I really can. Why don't you believe me? Mark said with an open face.
What can you do? You're a piece of trash.
Tia was so angry that she cursed again. If Miss Green was not there, Tia would have slapped Mark. Marcy didn't want to waste any more time. She raised her voice and said,
I'm here to invite Mr. Johnson to come with me today. If anyone dares to stop me, Don't blame me for what happens." Just this sentence dumbfounded the people of the Midler family. It also made Tia and Kelly cower. What a joke. Who would dare to stop Mark after Miss Green spoke? The people of the Midler family stared at each other and watched helplessly as Mark left with Marcy. Before he closed the door, Mark turned around and said excitedly to Nicole, "Nicole, wait for me. When I earn money, your company will be saved. Wait for me." The people from the Midler family were furious. This idiot was a complete fool. He really wanted to kill them all. Outside, Mark and Marcy got into a Rolls-Royce. The car drove steadily on the road. Marcy and Mark sat in the back seat. She had been watching this ordinary-looking man. He looked ordinary, but the persona he had was different from the others. But if he really was some amazing person, why did he become a son-in-law of that terrible Midler woman? Seeing Marcy staring at him, Mark suddenly asked, "Can you really give me 10 million?" Marcy was amused by him. What a joke. As the eldest daughter of the Green family, how could I not keep my word? Are you so afraid that I'll go back on my word? I've said it before. If you can cure my grandfather, you can forget about $10 million. I'll give you $1 billion. Mark shook his head seriously and said, "No need. I only need $10 million to save my wife's company." Your wife's company? So you're in such a hurry to earn $10 million to save your wife's company. But, Mr. Johnson, forgive me for being blunt, but your status in your wife's family doesn't seem to be very high. They don't seem to be friendly towards you. Marcy looked at him inquiringly. I'm used to it. Mark waved his hand and said, "As long as my wife treats me well, I don't care about the others." Marcy couldn't help but pout. She cleared her throat and said, I've got to say something you won't want to hear. If you cure my grandpa, I will give you 10 million. But if you can't cure him, I'll break one of your legs." "All right, as you wish." Mark still had a nonchalant expression, as if he didn't take this seriously at all. Marcy couldn't help but shake her head to herself. This young man was really hard to figure out. It didn't seem like he was posturing. It seemed that he really believed he had some special ability. After more than half an hour, the car stopped. The huge house was extremely luxurious. At first glance, it looked like a paradise for rich people. In the center of a huge lawn, there was a pale-colored house with white arches. It stood there imposingly. This most luxurious and special house belonged to the Green family. If Mark was an ordinary person who'd walked into this luxurious paradise all of a sudden, he'd inevitably felt excited but intimidated. But Mark was calm and composed, as if everything he looked at was as insignificant as an ant. But this luxurious house was somewhat familiar to him. 5 years ago, he had been living in just such a luxurious dwelling. Just like Marcy, he'd had luxury cars at his disposal. He'd also had many bodyguards. He tried his best to recall what happened 5 years ago, but there was a sharp pain in his head, and he couldn't. What was going on? Ever since his transformation, whenever he tried to recall what had happened in the past, his head would feel like it was being stabbed by needles. It was as if some sealed memories were a taboo that couldn't be touched. But Mark really wanted to know. The car pulled up to the entrance of the Green family's magnificent mansion, and Mark and Marcy got out. "What's wrong with you?" Marcy asked when she saw Mark's strange expression. "Nothing." Mark shook his head. "Let's go."
The two of them walked into the living room of the house and went up the stairs to the second floor. After pushing open the door of a room on the second floor, Mark looked inside. He was stunned. This room was very big, but it was not exactly a bedroom. An old man was lying in the bed with tubes attached all over his body. Various medical instruments and machines were placed in the room. The entire room was set up like a luxurious private hospital room. Those who didn't have money went to the hospital to see a doctor. Those who had money moved to the hospital directly into their home. This Green family was indeed extraordinary, but Mark's attention was focused on the old man. Marcy walked to the bedside and looked at the old man in the bed. The corners of her eyes were slightly moist.
My grandfather has been lying here for 3 years. His health was always very good until this. I don't know what happened, but he suddenly became like this 3 years ago.
Mark looked at the old man in the bed and said, "You said that your grandfather's condition is the same as my father-in-law's." Marcy nodded.
Because Grandpa and your father-in-law were both patients under Dr. Stevens. Over the past few years, I've invited some famous medical experts from both this country and abroad to treat my grandfather, but without success. My father and I have spent millions to set up a medical research team and recruit some of the world's top medical scientific experts, but no one has been able to cure my grandfather's illness.
Marcy shook her head. Her face was full of worry. Finally, she turned her eyes to Mark.
Mr. Johnson, please help him.
Mark didn't say anything. He sat down by the bed and grabbed the old man's hand to take his pulse. After a while, Mark said, "The accumulation of unknown toxins first gathered in the brain and caused brain death. Now it has spread to the whole body. It is exactly the same as my father-in-law's situation."
Marcy was stunned. What did you say? Poison?
To put it bluntly, yes, it is poison. But this kind of poison is very rare and not easily detected by others. Even the current medical technology can't detect it.
Marcy's face was full of surprise. Poison? How is it possible? How could Grandpa be poisoned?
Mark smiled wryly and muttered in his heart, "How the heck could I know how, nor why your grandfather was poisoned? I don't even know why my own father-in-law was poisoned." Then, out loud, Mark said in a relaxed tone, "Don't worry, I'll just insert a few needles." Mark put the old man's hand. Marcy couldn't help frowning. How could he just put a few needles in? This young man said it so quickly, as if her grandfather only had a cold or a fever. "Go and get someone to bring me a needle bag," Mark said in a commanding tone, but Marcy still didn't come back to her senses. Mark grew impatient. "What are you standing there for? Go and prepare a needle bag for me. There are so many medical instruments in your house. Don't tell me you don't even have a small needle bag."
A needle bag? Are you going to perform acupuncture on my grandpa?
Marcy asked. Mark replied, "Yes, I'll just insert a few needles and force the poison out of your grandpa's body. It'll be fine."
Marcy was a little confused. No, my grandpa's condition has been going on for 3 years. During that time, I've had some of the best and most famous doctors of traditional medicine in the country to treat my grandpa, but they didn't have any effect. Now you say that a few needles can save him?
Marcy thought,
why do I not believe it? If only Grandpa could just be pricked with a few needles and be cured. But others have tried.
But then she remembered that Dr. Stevens said on the phone that this young man used rebirth acupuncture. Mark said, "Miss Green, are you questioning me? If you don't have any trust in me, then sorry, I won't treat this illness." Mark stood up after saying that.
Marcy bit the bullet and said, "No, that's not what I meant. Mr. Johnson, don't be angry. I'll get someone to prepare a needle bag for you right now. No matter what, she had invited this young man here today. No matter what, she had to give it a try. Marcy ordered the needle bag. Very soon, someone brought over the needle bag used for acupuncture. Mark didn't stand at the ceremony. He immediately removed all the instruments that were attached to the old man's body. Then he took off the old man's shirt. But at this moment, footsteps suddenly approached the door, and then the door was pushed open. A middle-aged man in a suit and leather shoes, about 40 years old, walked in. The moment the middle-aged man walked in, he saw that Mark was pulling the tubes out of the old man's body and was about to take off his clothes. He was shocked and immediately shouted, "Stop! Stop right now!" Marcy looked at the man and said, "Uncle Bob, I didn't know you were home." This man was the second son of Red Green, who was lying in the bed. He was also Marcy's second uncle. His name was Bob Green, and he was a genius in the business world. He controlled most of the business operations for the Green family. Bob Green quickly walked over and grabbed Mark's hand. "Let go of my father." Bob saw that all the instruments on the old man's body were almost removed. He immediately became angry. He grabbed Mark's collar and scolded. "Where did you pop up from? How dare you mess with my father? Can't you see he's a sick man? I'm not sure I should let you live." Marcy hurriedly explained, "Uncle Bob, this person was found by me to treat Grandpa. Let him go. This is a misunderstanding." "Treatment? Just him?" Bob grew even angrier. He looked at Mark with contempt. "Who does he think he is, that he deserves to treat the old man?" Mark was also a little angry. What was wrong with this guy? He'd already said that he was here to treat the old man, but this guy had a bad attitude. Mark was here to treat the old man, not to be bullied. Thinking of this, Mark raised his hand and grabbed Bob's arm. He gently pushed Bob to the side. Then he adjusted his collar, which was in a mess, and said seriously, "I was invited by Miss Green to treat her grandfather. Please be more respectful." "You!" Bob's face was ashen. Then he turned his eyes to his niece, Marcy. "Nonsense. This is a load of nonsense. Marcy, how many times have I told you the old man's situation is not to be trifled with? Yet you go out and find some charlatan, some quack to treat him. If anything happens to the old man, who will be responsible?" I didn't find a quack. Uncle Bob, this person is called Mark. He was recommended by Dr. Mark Stevens. I personally invited him here. Don't underestimate him. He knows rebirth acupuncture. Perhaps he can really save my grandfather, Marcy explained. Faced with her Uncle Bob's explosive temper and impatience, she didn't know what else to say. Unexpectedly, Uncle Bob didn't listen to Marcy's explanation. He coldly harumphed and said, "Dr. Stevens? Even he couldn't cure the old man. How is this person able to cure the old man? What, rebirth acupuncture? That acupuncture technique was long ago lost in ancient times. Take a look at this person in front of you. Does he look like he knows rebirth acupuncture?" Bob looked at Mark with contempt once again. "Kid, looking at your appearance, you probably haven't even graduated from medical school yet. You actually pretend to be a doctor and even dare to say that you know what rebirth acupuncture is? This little trick of yours might work on a gullible young woman like Marcy, but it won't work on me. Now I'll give you one chance. Go back to where you came from. Otherwise..." Bob's face revealed a trace of color. What a joke. Their family patriarch's life was extremely precious. How could a kid who didn't look like he was even shaving yet manage to randomly diagnose and treat him? This kid probably didn't even have a medical certificate. He was nothing but a swindler. Mark laughed coldly, but he wasn't angry anymore. He said,
I came today to treat the old man. I'm here now. So, today, even if you don't want me to treat his illness, I still have to treat it. You? Bob was so angry that his eyes were blazing. Mark thought to himself, damn it, I finally found a chance to earn money. I can't just leave like this. Today, I'll definitely earn the money from the Green family. It's vital. It's all for the $10 million to save Nicole's company. Are you still in my house? Don't you believe that I won't ask someone to break your legs and throw you out in about 10 seconds? Bob said with a furious face. Marcy was a little anxious. Uncle Bob, this young man does know rebirth acupuncture. Just let him try. He knows rebirth acupuncture. Well, I know divine needle technique, Bob said, red with rage. Then he forcibly suppressed his anger. He tidied his clothes again and said to Marcy, Okay, I won't argue with such a person. It's beneath me to argue with him. Marcy, you invited him here. Now ask him to leave. Uncle Bob, Marcy started. Don't say anything else. I won't let such a young man treat my father. Yesterday, your father, my brother, called me to find out about any progress the overseas research and medical team and I might have made. I was happy to report that after 3 months of hard work, we finally developed a new drug for the old man's condition. Now the person in charge of the medical team, Dr. Frank, has arrived. When Dr. Frank injects the new medicine into the old man's body, the old man will definitely wake up. As Bob spoke, he spoke to the 2 bodyguards standing outside the door. Go and invite Dr. Frank up. When Mark heard this, he thought, oh, so it looks like I'm not the only one treating the old man today. There are also others. Then I want to take a look at this. Marcy was speechless. She was stunned for a moment and didn't know what to do. A few minutes later, a burly man in a white coat, about 30 years old, walked in accompanied by a bodyguard. This person had a huge Roman nose and deep eye sockets. He was carrying a small silver medicine box in his hand. He looked very stylish. After seeing this foreigner, Bob hurriedly went over and said respectfully, Oh my, Dr. Frank, you're finally here. You flew all the way back from overseas. You must be exhausted. So, this guy was Dr. Frank. Dr. Frank had a proud expression on his face as he shook hands with Bob. Mr. Green, you're too kind. Your family provides each of our research team a salary of $10 million per year. Of course, we will do our best. We must develop a medicine that can cure the old man. An annual salary of $10 million. This research team would probably have at least 10 people. This Green family was really generous. It seemed that they were indeed willing to pay any price to cure the old man. Marcy was not that enthusiastic about Dr. Frank. She said, Dr. Frank, there are some things that cannot be said with words. If I remember correctly, in the past 2 years, your research team has developed several kinds of medicines. Every time they say that they can bring Grandpa back to life, but each time they fail. Why should this time be any different? Dr. Frank said, Miss Green, I understand your skepticism, but rest assured, we've worked tirelessly day after day to find a cure for your grandfather's illness. Although the medicine that we developed a few times previously didn't achieve the desired effect, that doesn't mean we'll never succeed. On the road to success, there will inevitably be some exploration. I believe that every time we develop a new medicine, we get a little closer to a true cure. My grandfather is not your guinea pig, Marcy said without any hesitation. What do you mean by constantly experimenting on him? Dr. Frank's face turned ugly. Bob said, "Marcy, do not be rude to Dr. Frank." Marcy was right. The medicine that they previously developed didn't wake the old man up, which was annoying. Bob was also dissatisfied with progress, but no matter what, in the end, Dr. Frank's team was their only real hope. So, however impatient and disappointed they were, they couldn't afford to offend him. Dr. Frank said, "Miss Green, I assure you that the medicine we developed this time will definitely wake your grandfather up."
Assure me? You always assure me that.
Marcy obviously didn't buy it. Bob cleared his throat. "All right, Marcy, you should stop talking. Dr. Frank has been doing his best. As for whether the new medicine is useful or not, we will know after we give it a try." Dr. Frank nodded in agreement. "Yes, let us talk facts. I only need to inject this new medicine into the old man, and he'll wake up in a few minutes." As he spoke, Dr. Frank placed the medicine box in his hand on the table beside the bed. He opened the medicine box. Clearly, he wanted to get started on treatment immediately. When Dr. Frank arrived, Bob's and Marcy's attention was all on him. They seemed to have temporarily forgotten about Mark's existence. Seeing Dr. Frank take the needle out of the medicine box, Mark hurriedly walked over and said, "Wait, Dr. Frank, I should remind you that the old man's body is now full of poison. Injecting any medicine into him without first forcing out the poison will be dangerous, because any medicine can stimulate the poison in his body and accelerate its spread." Dr. Frank was stunned for a moment when he heard this, and then he looked at Mark. Obviously, Dr. Frank hadn't noticed Mark's existence before now. His blue eyes sized Mark up, and then he said with his nose in the air, "What did you just say?"